Hi everyone, my name is Rabia Khokhar, and I'm so excited to be presenting at the Melanin Magic Conference. My session is titled Creating Equitable and Identity Affirming Learning Spaces. Thank you so much for signing up for this session, as well as all of the other amazing sessions in this conference. So my session is really going to be focused on thinking critically about what equity means and looks like in various learning spaces. And it's going to be thinking critically about how identity plays a key role in equity work. And then we're going to think about some practical and tangible strategies that we can use in our classrooms in various learning spaces and how we can really bring equity theory to practice. Before we delve deep into our work, I just want to center our work with our land acknowledgement. I'm sharing the session today in Toronto. And I know that we're going to be watching it for various parts of the world. And I would encourage us all to learn a lot more about, the land that we're on and how it impacts and situates the work that we want to do and our commitments to equity and justice. So I'm going to be reading a land acknowledgement that I've written this summer. This summer, I've had the opportunity to really engage in some professional development where, one of the key learnings was to really think critically about the land that we're on and how it situates our work and our commitment to anti-racism and equity work. So I'm going to go ahead and read my land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the land that I'm learning from today is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also want to acknowledge that as a settler, I'm on Treaty 13 in Toronto. As a racialized person and an immigrant, my educational experiences never really taught me the truth about these lands. I was taught disjointed information here and there, which reinforced that Canada was a multicultural country that welcomed diversity and immigrants and always positioned Indigenous communities to a distant past. I did not learn the truth about the injustices against Indigenous communities and peoples, nor about their resistance and resilience against colonialism and genocide. As an educator and activist, I firmly believe in the role education plays in helping us learn the complete truth about the land we're on. We can't have reconciliation without first learning the truth, and I'm committed to first learning, unlearning, and relearning the truth of this land so I can teach this truth to my students. As a visible Muslim woman, I'm learning that systems of oppression are connected and interconnected, and that our oppression is different but stems from similar structures. If I'm committed to creating spaces that disrupt anti Muslim hate and Islamophobia, I know that this is not possible without first centering and advocating for Indigenous rights. Through my teaching and activism, I'm striving to be an ally with Indigenous communities, an ally who listens, learns, and acts towards justice and fairness. Thank you so much for listening. As I said before, reflecting on the land acknowledgement has really helped me think critically about my own role and my own commitments to Indigenous rights and how they interconnect with my commitments to being an educator who is centered in equity work. And so one of the first things of equity is really to center ourselves in the work that we're doing and to really position ourselves. So I really want to position myself and showcase the identities that I bring to this work and how it impacts the type of educator that I always strive to be. So I come to this work of teaching and learning as a learner first. I'm committed to being a lifelong learner. I come to this work as a teacher. I'm an elementary teacher in Toronto, and I'm always thinking about, what does equity look like in the different positions that I have and that I hold. So I've taught kindergarten. I've taught English as a second language. I've been a teacher librarian for K-6 students. So I'm always thinking critically about what equity looks like in these different roles and these positions that I find myself in. I come to this work as a teacher leader. This workshop and this conference is such an amazing way to really help all of us educators really think and reflect on our pedagogy. And when we think critically about our pedagogy, it really helps us, think critically about our actions and that impact students, and really focused on, bringing this learning and continuing this learning for educators as well. I come to this work as a settler. I come to this work as a racialized person who never really ever saw her identities reflected in the classroom. If they were reflected, it was always a misrepresentation. So I come to this work with those experiences, but also as an educator who has positional power now to create some change. And I come to this work as an activist who fundamentally believes that education is one of the ways that we can move towards more inclusion, equity, and humanity and dignity for all people. I come to this work as an aunt. And, my niece really reminds me of the type of education system and learning spaces and classroom spaces that all children deserve and need to have access to. So all of these different identities and positionalities really center the type of educator and teacher and human being that I want to be in this world and these communities. And so really focusing on our presentation today, part one will be theory and frameworks. We're going to be thinking a little bit about what equity is. We're going to be thinking about how identity plays a role in this work. And part two will be really theory to practice. So here I will share some of the strategies that have worked for me. And so part one, what is equity? And so equity is a condition or state of fair, inclusive, and respectful treatment of all people. Equity does not mean treating people the same without regard for individual differences. So equity is really thinking about, creating spaces where students of all identities are given what they need to succeed, which is high quality education. And so, an equity stance recognizes that people have diverse identities, and because of their identities they experience the world differently, and it recognizes that systems are not fair, and it works to restore and to create spaces that respect all identities, but also remove barriers or create new structures where all people can really thrive and excel and do their best. And so, oftentimes we sort of lean into a diversity, multiculturalism centered approach. And so this has been my learning as well. So I've sort of thought critically about what diversity is and then what equity is. So, a diversity approach is very much like a lens. It's an additive approach, whereas an equity-centered approach is a stand. So it's something that is always in our heart. It's something that we always believe. It's cross-curricular. It's always there. Whereas a diversity approach might believe in, the idea of neutrality, that, everyone is the same, and, we really have to focus on thinking about our similarities as opposed to our differences. An equity-centered approach recognizes human diversity, and it recognizes that because of our diversity, we experience the world differently. It sees diversity not as a deficit, but really a strength and an asset. And it really works to see the complete person with all of their intersectional identities and experiences. So whereas like a diversity-centered approach is often a surface level investigation where, we'll celebrate the differences between people in terms of like celebrating their food and their festivals. An equity-centered approach really, recognizes that to truly make the world fair and inclusive for people of all identities, there needs to be individual as well as systemic changes that, people need to really thrive. And so, a diversity approach really talks about, how we really focuses on like, being kind, and how and really the solution is really just kindness, and we don't really move beyond kindness. And, it really puts the onus on the individual and the individual actions without really recognizes the systems at play that really create those experiences that people have. And so one of the key aspects of an equity-centered approach is really critical consciousness. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about critical consciousness, but really an equity-centered approach is, moving beyond the surface. It's something that's, embedded in everything that we do. It recognizes that we have to talk about our similarities as well as our differences, and our differences are not a deficit or a defect. And it recognizes that, to truly create change, we need individual as well as systemic actions. And so it's really important to really, there's no problem in starting with a diversity approach, because that's usually step one, but we really have to move from diversity to really equity-centered approach in everything that we do in schooling. And, really bringing this equity-centered approach to practice is really recognizing that equity is not separate from, the curriculum. Equity is not something that we do sometimes. Equity is not a unit that we do or something that we do like, in particular months of the year. Equity is something that we do all the time. It's embedded into every action and every curriculum topic and every interaction that we really have with our students. Equity is really the work of the curriculum. And, for it to really be the curriculum, we have to recognize that equity work has to be sustainable. So it's not a one-time action that we do, but it is something that, is sustainable. It's something that we're building up and building to all the time. And, this slide is a little bit focused more on a Canadian or like a provincial standard or a school board standard that I work on. But really the key learning from this slide is really that equity is a passion, yes, but equity is also responsibility. There's policies that are, provincial wide, that are school board wide, that really show that equity is not something that we're just doing sometimes, or equity is not something that some educators are, partaking or doing. Equity is the work of everybody. It is our responsibility as educators to really ensure that we are teaching from an equitable standpoint. It is policy work, and it is our work as educators. It's not something separate from our work. It is really the way that we need to be doing our work. And equity work has to be contextual. So equity work will look different in various spaces, in various classrooms. Equity work is not necessarily a checklist. There's frameworks that we can follow, but equity work is not a checklist, and it's going to look different in different spaces. And I think that's something that we need to know. And the example that I'd like to give is this book that was very popular in Toronto and Canada. And it's a book focused on a particular city in India, and it talks about how the grandmothers in this village or this city were not able to attend school because of various factors. And so now there's a grandmother school where grandmothers are able to go to school, they're able to learn their alphabet. And this is a really beautiful and amazing book that's really specific to a particular space in India. And so it's very important to share this story with students, but it's very important that the sharing is contextual. This story will be read differently in different settings, and that's kind of the work of equity as well. Equity work is different, and it's going to look different in different spaces. So, for example, in some spaces, I might share this as one book in my unit. In other spaces, I might not highlight this book, but it might just be a book that I display. And so it's very important to know that equity is going to look different. It's going to be messy, but it's going to be something that's going to be different in the different spaces that we occupy, depending on our students, depending on the neighborhood that we teach in. And so many factors that come into play. And so this is just a key example that shows us that, everything that we're doing in our space needs to be very, thought out, intentional. It has to be very responsive and relevant for the students that are in front of us. And that's really the key of equity work as well. And so, we've thought a lot about equity and what equity is, what it can look like. So how does identity work fit into equity work? Well, identity is really, something that describes everything who we are. Like identity is a word that really describes everything that makes us who we are. And we're part of a personal identity group, and we're also part of group and social identities. And so personal identities are kind of like our names, our hobbies, our physical features, our personalities, our likes and our dislikes. And all of these personal identity pieces make us unique and different individuals. We're all different from each other, and that's kind of where personal identities come into play. But we're also part of social groups, and our social groups are, identity markers such as culture, religion, if we follow one, race, gender expression, our language, our age, our family, and so many other various subgroups that we're part of. And so, our group identity shows us that, we share parts of our identities with other people who might identify in the same way. And it's really important to know that we're part of many different groups. We all have intersectional identities. And so some of our identities are visible identities, which just means that, they're more visible, and people can maybe see them more visibly. For example, I wear a hijab, so a lot of people, can assume or recognize that one of my identities might be that I identify as Muslim. So some of our visible identities are more visible to people. And our invisible identities are more identities that, people have to really get to know us to really see who we are and really see those parts of our identities. And, both of these are not set in stone, they're in flux. But really, our visible identities, or our perceived visible identities, really impact the experience that we have in the world, whether that's on an individual level with somebody or a systemic level. And so, our visible identities, or the assumptions of our visible identities, or the perceptions of our visible identities, really create the experiences that we have in the world that might be fair or unfair. So really, equity work is really focused on creating spaces where people of all identities can really be represented and really thrive. And so identity is paramount in this conversation, because who we are impacts how we experience the world. Oops. Sorry. Identity work is fundamental to equity work, because who we are impacts how we experience the world, and who we are also helps us situate ourselves in the conversation. So as educators, knowing the different pieces of our identities helps us um, center center ourselves in the work. It helps us see where we might be disadvantaged, but where we have advantages. And so, I think it's very important to know who we are as educators, because it impacts how we come to the work. And so, as a racialized visible Muslim woman, in different parts of my life, I might not have a lot of privilege, or my privilege might be different, but I know that as an educator, I have situational, like positional power, where I can create an impact, and I have advantage where if I'm really intentional about my choices and my actions, I can really create a difference in the lives of my students. And so knowing who I am and how I come to this conversation and how I come to this work helps me think critically about what I can do to really, dismantle oppressive systems. And so identity work, thinking about our own identities and thinking about the identities of our students, is critical to equity work. And so, these are some of the questions that I ask myself when I find myself in various teaching assignments. So, like, who am I? What are my visible and invisible identities? Where do I have privilege? Where do I not? How does this information impact the type of educator and leader I want to be? Where is my positional power? And what can I do to really create a change? You know, knowing who we are helps us be reflective, and it helps us be equitable educators. So identity work is really the heart of equity work. And so, you know, this is a very common power flower exercise. This is an exercise that is very, very helpful to engage in, because it helps us, you know, think critically about our own identities. It helps us uh, it helps us check where we have privilege, where we might not have privilege, and really it helps us be very reflective and aware of who we are and how we come to this work. So I would really encourage you, if you haven't already, to really engage in this power flower exercise. It's also something that we can bring to our students, and it might look different in grade 1, it might look different in grade 6, but it's definitely a useful tool for ourselves as educators as well as our students. And, you know, I think when we talk about identity, intersectionality is something that has to come up, because we're not just one thing. We're so many different we're so many different things, and we're part of so many different social groups that really impact our experiences in the world. So, you know, I think it's very important for us to know that we are part of many different identity groups, and that really makes us, you know, unique individuals. And it's also a word that, you know, is very important to help and bring to our students, because I think it's important for our students to know that we're not just one thing. And I think when we introduce this idea of intersectionality, it really helps us move to from a diversity approach, which is often like a surface level investigation. So in this, you know, in this investigation, we might be writing our age and, you know, maybe the languages we speak. But when we sort of move to an equity stance, if you remember the chart from the beginning, you know, thinking about intersectionality, where we can see how we are more than one thing, and we're part of so many different groups. It's very helpful for students to know that as well, because, you know, they're not one thing. And I think when we complicate these things, it also moves us towards, you know, seeing the complete person, because identity is not something that's, you know, neat and packaged. And so intersectionality helps us really move towards reality, and it helps us really see all of the parts that make us who we are. These are just some other aspects and some different images to really show the idea of intersectionality, like the coming together. This is really talking, you know, it's a common image of the iceberg, the identity iceberg, and it shows us and draws our attention to, you know, our visible identities, our invisible identities, and, you know, how those are also in flux. But it shows us how those very those small aspects of who we are, or what people see and perceive us as being, impact so much of our lived experiences. And so it's very important that we create spaces in our classrooms that help us see all of these parts of our students as well, or help our students share all of these parts with us as well. These are also images where, you know, it's very visible, and these are images that we can bring to our students as well, because it really helps them visualize and really see those personal and social identity groups, you know, and it's something that we can also maybe make with our students. And so I think I would just ask you to, you know, pause for a minute or so, and just think about what are 3 things people might assume about you based on your visible identities? And what are 3 things they don't see but you wish they saw or knew about you? And so, you know, I would just ask you to maybe reflect on this. What are 3 things people assume about you based on your visible identities? And what are 3 things they don't see but you wish they saw or knew? And then how can you bring this activity to your classrooms that you're in or that you're going to be going in very soon. So I just ask you to pause a little bit here and just reflect. Awesome. You know, it's very important to engage in the activities that we're also bringing to our students, because it really helps us first think critically about how we come to this activity, and really, you know, helps us create sort of a blueprint of what this activity might look like, or how our students might engage in this. And if we feel comfortable, we can also share some of our own answers with students to really model this. And so, you know, as we move on, thank you so much for reflecting. As we move on, we really want to think critically about like why equity work, why identity affirming spaces. And so, you know, I think locally in Toronto and provincially, as well as globally, there's been a lot of hate that's been happening against Indigenous communities. There's anti-Asian hate. There's a lot of Islamophobia. And so, you know, when we think about creating identity affirming spaces and we think about the role of the classroom, you know, the classroom is always a transformative space. The classroom is really a hopeful space. And so, if we want, you know, if we want there to be no more hate that is very much identity based, we really have to do our work intentionally in the classroom. The classroom has always been a space where, you know, we can model what inclusion, what equity, what respect really looks like. And so to really rid or dismantle this oppression and this hate, it can really start in our classrooms. And so this work is important, because so much of the hate that's in the world is so much focused on identity and dividing people. And so if we focus our work in our classroom, where we're really affirming the different identities and helping our students learn about each other, then I really feel like we are working to dismantle hate. And this is all of our work. So that's really the work of equity. And that's really how equity and identity are, you know, very fundamental to each other. They're foundational elements to each other, and they're foundational to creating us an inclusive community, whether it's local or global. And so this was one of the lawn signs that was going around in Toronto and really Ontario, when a lot of hate motivated crimes were happening that were very, you know, specifically targeting identities. And so, you know, if we really want this to come to action, when we're saying hate has no room here or home here, we have to consider the role of our classrooms and the impact that we as educators can have in really dismantling hate. And so, you know, part of this workshop is really thinking about this work for ourselves, but really thinking about how to then bring this to our students as well. And so, you know, this is a stereotype and bias awareness airplane scenario. It's quite popular, but imagine you're traveling alone on a 20-hour plane ride. Checking in, you learn that the plane is almost full, but the service agent says that he will let you choose your seatmate. Remember, this is a long flight, so choose wisely. So this scenario that we're just going to engage in is going to really help us think critically about identities, stereotypes, and biases. It's a good scenario to engage in ourselves as educators, and it's also something that we can, in an age-appropriate way, bring to our students to help them learn about identity, stereotypes, bias. It's really a scenario that can help students learn this very important language through a very scaffolding and safe way. And so in this scenario, you have to choose who your passenger will be. So passenger 1 is an Olympic athlete. Passenger 2 is a refugee. Passenger 3 is a former high security prisoner. Who will be your seatmate and why? And so each of these, passengers, when we think about them, there's particular identity groups that have already popped into our mind. And that's really based on our socialization. Media really heavily influences who we see as doing what or being who. And so if we think critically about this, who is going to be our seatmate and why? And so if you chose passenger one, the Olympic athlete was Ibtihaj Muhammad, a Black woman, a Black Muslim woman who is a fencer. Passenger two, who is a refugee, was Einstein. And passenger three, a former high security prisoner, was Nelson Mandela. And so, we did this a little bit rushed, but it would be really amazing to explore each of the different passengers, to think critically about which identities might these passengers have, why, and then to do the reveal of showing who these passengers actually were, and thinking critically about who did we think they were, why. This is a really great conversation starter and exploration activity that helps us think about identity, stereotypes, and biases. And it helps us be aware of, why we think things about certain people. And so that really takes us to, being critically aware and, positioning ourselves in the work that we're doing, and really thinking about our explicit and implicit biases, being aware of who we are and, what we think about some people of different identities, and being aware of our explicit biases and implicit biases is really important. So explicit bias is very much like your language or your words, would be biased, and it's very explicit. So it's something that everybody can see. So an implicit bias is something that you might not be saying it out loud, but your actions or your body language might be saying it loudly. And an implicit bias might not be something that you're even aware of. It's just inside all of us. We all have biases, and so it's very important that we are engaging in these various critical and reflective pieces to know who we are and how we come to this work. And so, we've spent a lot of time building our theory. We've talked a lot about equity. We've talked a lot about identity and how these two mesh together and how they're foundational. So then what does this theory to practice really look like? What are some strategies and frameworks and tangible tools that we can use to really bring this into action? And this part of the workshop in the session, I'm going to be sharing some tools and strategies that have worked for me in the various different teaching assignments that I've had. So I'm going to be sharing 6 different strategies with you, which I kind of call a social justice model that really centers and builds identity affirming learning spaces. So I'm going to take you through these 6 different strategies. So strategy number 1 is center an asset-based stance. It's very important that, as educators, we're seeing all of our students completely for who they are. We're seeing all parts of our students, and we're really having high expectations of all of our students. And, we're seeing their infinite humanity and dignity. And so I love this quote by Desmond Tutu. Each person should be valued as being of infinite worth, irrespective of differences, and that with their attitude, we will ultimately create a more caring and just society. And so, all children come to school to be seen completely and to be loved. And it's our role as people in their lives and people with positional powers to really see them completely, to believe in them, to respect them, and to really see all of their strengths and assets. If we start with the strengths, we can really build a positive relationship and rapport with our students. And so this is a poster that I have in my classroom where, I really am centered on seeing and valuing all of my students, and really starting with a strength-based approach where I really see the dignity of each of my students. In the past, I also have written a letter to my students in the beginning of the year that really is centered on high expectations and, my respect and belief in them. And this really sets the classroom environment up in a very positive tone. And it really shows students that I believe in them and that I'm going to be there for them. And, I believe that they're smart. And most children, these are the words and these are the languages that they want to hear. We all do. We all want to be seen positively, and we all want to be, seen for who we are. And so if we start with the positives, it really creates room for a beautiful, report that can continue. I'm also very intentional about, how I'm designing my classroom. I want to design my classroom with my students, but, the beginning posters and positive posters and, pictures that I have in my classroom already up are really posters that show students that I see them through an asset lens. So these are some of the posters that I have. And it really also, just to go back to one of the images, it also shows our commitment to our students and to this work of equity. And so strategy number 2 is to teach cultural competence and affirm identities and experiences. So, our learning environments, to really affirm identities, we have to create space where students have a chance to, explore who they are, affirm who they are, see themselves reflected and represented. And that really builds a strong sense of self. And so, cultural competence is to help students appreciate and celebrate their cultures, and also gain knowledge of others. And so, strategy number 2 is to really celebrate and build a strong sense of self, of who they are. And then we're going to be talking a little bit more about, learning about other people. So these are some of the questions that I ask, I ask myself: who are my students? Do they share some of my identities? How does this inform my, teaching curriculum development? How can I learn more about them? And how do I always see them through an asset-based lens? And it's very similar to the community that I'm serving as well. How am I going to center a strength-based, asset-based lens? How am I building, sustainable relationships that are really centered on allyship? So these questions sort of affirm and, create space for me to affirm my students' identities, because I start by, being committed to seeing all parts of my students. So we do a lot of affirming of identities through the books that we read. This is a beautiful book that really spoke to the experiences that my students were having this year, where they're coming and they're new Canadians, and so they're navigating this new home. But at the same time, they're still trying to, respect, honor, and hold on to the homes that they're coming from and all of those cultural groups. So this book really spoke to the experiences of my students, and it was very responsive and relevant. It helped them see their experience reflected, as well as, building a strong sense of self. These are just some of the posters we have where we affirm students' identities. Our students speak so many beautiful languages, and we want to try to reflect that in our classroom setting and design. And so, this year, a lot of my students were talking about how, they hate their name and they wish their name was more Englishy, and, they feel like they're not from here. And, they wanted to use a crayon that didn't really match their skin tone. And so, we wanted to sort of affirm this experiences our students were having, but also create space for them to celebrate who they were. So we created a unit that was focused on names, because a lot of our students were saying, their names are too difficult. And so, we read a lot of books that really affirmed the experiences that they were having, but also helped them, learn some strategies to feel pride and proud and recognize that their names are part of their identities. This then branched off to doing name poems, and just the unit was just really extended. And I think part of it was by really seeing all parts of our students and creating space to see all parts of who they were and how that impacts their schooling experience. And so, as we were learning these experiences that our students were having, we were thinking critically about how we were, creating lesson plans and really thinking about how we were delivering curriculum. And so we were trying to disrupt color blindness. We wanted to talk about similarities as well as our differences. And so, we had a map and we thought about the different flags, and where we came from and how we're different, but we're also similar and we're all connected. And then this branched into, doing a complete unit on identity and, creating self-portraits, trying to find our skin-colored crayon and doing a lot of writing about who we were and what we were proud of. Thinking about our inside as well as our outside differences. And so strategy number 3 that I've used that really works for my students is teaching cultural competence. And this is through expanding identities and lived experiences. And so this is really thinking about who's not in my space? Why are they not here? And how can I teach about them respectfully and authentically? So how do we learn about ourselves? And then how do we learn about other people who might be in our space and who might not be in our space? And so we sort of did this teaching through thinking critically about, different people doing amazing things. So, for a Women's History Month project that we did, we talked about lots of different inspirational women, lots of different identities, age groups, cultures. And, we learned about people who were different from us through their own stories. And that was really helpful because it helped us expand our ideas of what an inspirational person is, what an inspirational woman is, what they can look like. And then strategy number 4, which really worked for us in various different learning spaces, is really thinking critically about our resources. We really want our resources to be responsive, relevant for our students, and it's really where we can really bring equity theory to practice with our intentional choices, and then how we use to, display or teach from the resources. And so it's important to look at the stats. They're a little bit old, but it's important to, see which students have books about them all the time and the different genres. Like this white boy has so many different mirrors to, look through. He can be king, he can be an astronaut. And as we go down, we can see that the mirrors get smaller, they're crooked, they're like broken. And so it's very important to see and to reflect who always has, books about them, different genres, different experiences, and who doesn't, and how can we use our positional power to really create a change in this. And, we know that books are mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And so how can we use our positional power to, bring in those intentional choices to really affirm all of the identities of our students that might be in our space, as well as expand and teach them about people who might not be here in our space, in our, in our classroom or our school community, but who are members of our communities, whether they're local, global. And so books and resources, I found, are really one of the key ways to bring equity theory to practice. And they're really the ways that we can ensure that we're thinking critically about how we're delivering curriculum. And so, I did some learning, and a lot of the books are books like The World Needs More Purple People, which really takes us away from learning about identity and thinking critically deeply and in an intersectional way about identity. um where there is this colorblind narrative that's going on, where we don't really need to see our identities, or we don't really need to name our identities because we're all purple. And I think books like this are okay in our entire collection, but if we are going to be creating identity affirming classroom learning spaces, and we want all of our students to learn the vocabulary of who they are, build a strong sense of respect for themselves as well as others, we really need books like this that help students, name their experiences as well as name their identities. We need more specific books that help our students engage in this work by providing language, by providing examples. And if we think critically and intentionally about the resources that we're using, it's really foundational to the work that we want to do as educators committed to equity. And so strategy number 5 was really moving from additive approaches to really universal design. So in Toronto and in Canada, we really have, heritage months. So October is often Islamic Heritage Month. February is Black History Month. And I think it's amazing to have these months where we're really, critically looking at stories and histories of people who have been oppressed and continue to be oppressed and have been marginalized and silenced from the curriculum. But we don't want to just see those people of those identities during those specific months. We want to see all types of people all the time, and we want to be thinking critically about the types of stories and the types of experiences that we're sharing. So we want to share stories and experiences that show people in very dynamic ways, and that really move away from single stories. So we want to move away from only sharing about Muslims during Islamic Heritage Month, and we want to not only share story, we don't want to share stories that show Muslims as only being out of the West and being really oppressed. And we want to show Muslims and all types of characters all the time in our curriculum as being everyday people engaging in universal experiences, and celebrating them. As in a similar way, we want to think critically about how Black people are represented in our curriculum. Are we only talking about the Black community during Black History Month? Are we only sharing those same narratives of pity and enslavement? We really want to celebrate and see all people's humanity and their dignity, and we can restore people's humanity and dignity by seeing them and celebrating all parts of who they are. And so that really starts when we move to a universal stance, and not necessarily adding particular people of various identities and plugging them into various months. It's an okay place to start, but we really have to sort of move beyond those additive approaches and embed people of all identities in all parts of our curriculum. And so that really has to take a lot of intentional thinking and an intentional reflection on our part as educators to really create our curriculum that is very responsive and relevant for students, that will affirm who they are and help them expand and learn more about different types of people. And one of the ways that we did this, one of the ways that we did this in our classroom this year was embedding students' names and students' experiences and their community in the math word problems we were using. We were using a textbook word problems, and we were finding that our students were not really engaging, or yeah, they weren't really engaging with it, or it wasn't very engaging. And so we created some word problems that centered the lived experiences of our students. It included their names, but it also included experiences that they could recognize, that they could reflect on, that was responsive for them. And once we sort of created these word problems, we found our students were so engaged and excited, and that really was a learning opportunity for me to really see how we have to embed various identities in all aspects of what we do. It's not just during social studies, but it's also during math, and it's also during language. And so this was a really great learning strategy for me. This was also a project that I did with a group of students in the past, where we really thought about heroes and community heroes, and seeing all parts of this amazing woman, and the contribution she made to her community, and not just learning about her during Black History Month, but um, positioning her as a community hero and helper. In a similar way, Albert Jackson was Toronto's first Black postal worker. And so, not just bringing his story in during Black History Month, but, um, the primary curriculum is very focused on community and community helpers. And so, rethinking what we teach during those during those units, and to really use those spaces to build and design our curriculum in a universal design space, where we're really centering and teaching students stories and histories and current events that are responsive and relevant and critically conscious. These are just some more resources. This one was very helpful for our students, because oftentimes we think about Remembrance Day and we think about soldiers, and who fought or who was a soldier or what a soldier looks like. And this image helps us think critically about the different identity groups that were part of this story, and it helps us really expand who we see as a soldier and as somebody who's contributed to their community and to their society. And so it's important that we're intentionally creating space to center different identity groups that have always been here and that have always contributed to community, and the things and these experiences that were happening. So strategy number 6 is really teaching students critical consciousness. And so this was an activity that was done to really help students think critically. So critical consciousness is really thinking about, why are things the way that they are in the world, and what can we do about it? What's our role to create a change? And so this was an activity that was done by a grade 2-3 class, where they really thought about unfair rules. And so in this book, this boy, Ron, he's unable to borrow a library book because he's Black. And so this book really helped students think critically about what systemic means, and it helped them think about how the rules and the structures are often unfair for people of different identities. And so they thought about this, and through this book we helped elicit definitions that were really brought forward by students, like unfairness, fairness, racism, anti-racism, and critical consciousness. We always want students to think critically about what their role is to create change. And so students wrote letters to the government talking about how all kids deserve education, and some rules are unfair. They also made a little button. So all of those aspects were really important for them, because they learned something. And then they took an action to create more positive change. And so that really brings us to the end of this workshop and this session. I hope that it was helpful and meaningful as we work towards equity, and how we think critically about our own identities, as well as the identities of our students, and how that can really help us um, create identity affirming classroom spaces. The classroom is always a transformative space, and we as educators really have an important role to play in these conversations. So I leave you with this quote, which really reminds me that, education and teaching is an act of responsibility. And I thank you so much for listening and being part of this conversation.